Today's lecture will be on Chapter 11 from the book titled Inheritance and Polymorphism. I have arranged this lecture as follows. You guys can see this in your graphic. Each topic is separated so that you can easily follow it. If you are looking at the just the slides itself, then each section will have this particular title. If you are reviewing the lecture recordings, then each of these topics will also have its own separate file. And that way it just helps you to get to the topic you're most interested in. You can get through this much quicker. So we'll begin with an overview, and we'll talk about the 4 principles of object-oriented programming. The first one, we discussed this in Chapter 10, is called encapsulation. We also discussed this briefly in Chapter 9. Not too much detail. Now we're actually getting more into the meat and potatoes of this topic. Encapsulation is all about hiding your code. If you are the class author, which is a term we introduced in Chapter 10, if you are a class author, then you want to hide your code from class users. And we do this, and these are just general rules of thumb that's on this slide, is to make all your non-static members private. Of course, there may be situations where you do not want to do that, but for purposes of this class, in most cases, if you just follow that rule, making all your non-static members private, you should be good to go. And as we get more and more into it, as you get more and more comfortable with encapsulation, it will become easier and much understandable when you need to not follow this rule. Another property of encapsulation is to make your accessors and mutators public so that your class users can access those data fields. So if you have your members private, all you need to do now is create methods that access those members through accessors, which are your getters. Mutators are your setters. Make those methods public, and your class users will then have a mechanism to grab your data fields, modify them, manipulate them, access them, things of that nature. Another principle of object-oriented programming that we have already discussed is abstraction. Abstraction is making sure we create boundaries in such a way so that an object only contains relevant properties. When we're dealing with abstraction, in most cases, you're going to create multiple Java files. Now that we are in 2.3.02, in most cases, it would be just standard to have multiple Java files for a particular assignment. It will be your responsibility to figure out what goes in each Java file. Proper abstraction means I have a logical organization so that what's in each Java file actually makes sense. For example, let's say I had an athlete.java and a race.java. My athletes were runners in this particular race. So for each athlete, they should have a first name and a last name. Those members should be they should belong to the athlete.java file, should they not? It would be bad abstraction if I place the first name and last name and put that in the race.java file. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't belong there. So this is where when we talk about abstraction, is making sure that things belong to where they should be. In other words, and we talked about this in Chapter 10, there should be an association, and things that have an association, you want to make sure they belong to a parent. Now we'll move on to the next principle of object-oriented programming, and this is inheritance. This is discussed in Chapter 11. In my opinion, inheritance is probably the most important principle to understand. I think the other 3 principles make inheritance more powerful, more flexible, more manageable. So it's really important to understand inheritance. I think if it was up to me, I probably would have started with inheritance, but the author of this book chose to start with abstraction. Um, but we'll get into inheritance now. Inheritance is reusing code. Reusing code, which allows us now to create relationships with new code where we can now build upon existing code. We're going to talk more about that later on, but just understand inheritance is I have a relationship between my objects where one object could be the parent of another, and because of that, that child object, the one that it inherits, has certain properties from the parent. We'll get into that more and more. Just make sure you understand that what inheritance is, and we'll discuss it later on throughout this lecture. And the final principle of object-oriented programming is polymorphism. Polymorphism is where we have multiple methods with the same name but slightly different functionality. And again, this was introduced in chapter 11, so we'll talk more about that. But just to be clear, I think inheritance is the principle that you really should make sure you understand. Make sure you master that. You can speak intelligently about what inheritance is, what it looks like in code, and then try to understand how the other three principles make inheritance a little more flexible, more powerful, more robust, more manageable. So that will now conclude this portion of the lecture. Feel free to move on to the other sections as needed.